Hi, I'm Reid.
And I'm Daniel.
And welcome to Nordic Notes, episode 2. We hope you enjoyed our last episode about AI law and regulations in the European Union. But today we're going to talk about something a little bit more fun, I think. Daniel, do you want to tell us a little bit about this guy behind us?
He has a lot of FOMO.
He has a lot of FOMO. He's a VC with a lot of FOMO.
Yes.
So VCs, not just this guy behind us, but all VCs think that they can predict the future. That is definitely a part of the job here, which we love, obviously, but it's also really hard, and nobody really can predict the future. So we're not going to sit here and look into our crystal ball, which is no better than anybody else's, of course. Instead, we're going to take you through some of our friends and other interesting VCs' crystal balls out there. And so let's jump right into it.
Let's do it.
So let's start with this interesting article from Sifted, where they've gone through 11 different VCs and their predictions for 2024. And we're not going to go through all 11 of them, but we can zoom into a couple of quite interesting ones. And I wanted to start with Helga, our friend at Crowberry Capital, who of course we've invested with. And she has some very interesting insights, I think, on what's to come for this year. Obviously, she looks back at the last couple of years and how it's been quite difficult in venture for a number of reasons, not to mention geopolitical uncertainty and higher interest rates. But obviously, we expect to see quite a few interesting opportunities around AI, data management, AI governance, compliance, and ethics. Again, all related to what we discussed in our last episode. But what I thought was very interesting about her observations here, and again I completely agree, is the importance of looking into augmented reality, virtual reality, or mixed reality in the context of the upcoming launch of the Apple Vision Pro and the recent launch of MetaQuest 3. So this is a sort of new era of what they call spatial computing, or being able to use applications in 3 dimensions.
And I believe that the waiting lists are open now, at least for the Apple devices, right?
Yeah, for the Vision Pro. And for a device that costs almost $4,000, we're seeing still a huge amount of demand.
And they will ship in February.
Yes, they will ship in February.
Actually, this is very soon, and
Yeah.
we'll see what's happening this year.
Absolutely. And obviously, as investors, we have to be ahead of where the ball is going, so to speak. So we are looking into this space and have been for the last few years. VCs have been waiting for this inflection point in AR, VR for a very long time. And I think there's a lot of optimism that with the Apple Vision Pro, that inflection point is coming very soon. But let's move on to a slightly different prediction, and I want to talk a little bit about my former colleague, Katya Almasque from OpenOcean. And she talked a little bit about the investors who have left the industry in 2023 due to this non-inclusive culture around many venture firms. And I think that is absolutely tragic. Obviously, her prediction is that there won't be an immediate recovery this year, and that women are facing immense pressure to deliver within venture, but also as founders of startups. Her view is that women are judged more harshly than men, as many of them have entered the industry more recently than their male counterparts. So they don't have that sort of same time to build a track record around their investments as men in the same positions might have done for the last 15 years or so. And I think that's a really interesting insight and something that we don't necessarily talk about enough. Obviously, here at Luminar, we have almost half of our team are women, and I think living in the Nordics, you might be confused into thinking that this is the normal way that things work, but of course that's not true. And finally, I think the point I wanted to raise here from Early Bird, from Hendrik, is also very important to think about. Obviously, we are in the midst of a down cycle, there's no doubting that. But his view, and I think if you look at the history, the data proves this out, downturns typically last around 3 years. If you had to draw an average, you're looking at a 3-year period. And we are expecting this sort of end of this year to be perhaps the beginning of the curve back up again into a bull market. Now, of course, there's no real way to tell whether that's going to happen or not. This is, again, just looking into a crystal ball. But it's worth mentioning we are in year 3 now, entering year 3 of this current down cycle. All right, I'll
Cool.
hand over to you for our next VC prediction.
Next VC prediction is from Martin at BuyFounders, one of my favorites. We have invested together and worked together. He's a very insightful guy. And so we definitely wanted to mention some of his predictions for the coming year. And the first one is that the IPO market might open up slightly. And I think our industry is super cyclical. The VC industry is typically like a year or so behind, or the private market, I should say, maybe behind the public markets. And certainly there is a big chance of recovery in the public market during this year, which might open up for IPOs. And there are some really interesting candidates. He mentioned some of them, like Stripe, Databricks, Plaid, and so on. And maybe now also Figma, because we saw that obviously
deal fall apart.
Did fall apart. And I think I totally agree with that. And I think there is also actually an option for slightly smaller companies that might actually choose the IPO route, given the sort of lag in the VC industry to some extent. So that's an interesting one. There will be blood and fundraising frenzy, probably true as well. He provides some pretty interesting graphics here. It's from Carta, where you can see that startups with 10 million plus raised were not immune to this downturn, certainly not. We've seen a few really quite substantial companies falling down as well. Not only the seed companies that we typically invest in who have way less money, way less runway, is actually also for the big ones. And typically many companies were very well financed. They had 3 years of runway or something. Now we're entering the third year, so we'll see what happens. Very good one. And then he speaks a bit about the pre-seed and the seed space, which will continue to be competitive. And it's partly because it hasn't been immune, but it has been somewhat protected during this downturn in the way that many funds have started to do seed investments and pre-seed investments, because they can see those investments materialize during these few years of downturn and then pick up when things are going back up again. So you can see here in this graph where you see the sort of green parts are the ones that have been less affected. Simplify. And if you look at pre-seed and seed, it hasn't been as affected as if you compare to Series D, where you have the red ones over here in 2023. So that's an interesting one.
And of course, I think valuations at seed and pre-seed are very different, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about dilution rather than talking about the actual value of the business.
Absolutely. And he mentions one thing here as well, that from Thomas Tungus, and I think it's an interesting one, an important one, is that you had these up rounds before that were quite significant, and especially they were super fast, right? So you had this Series A rounds raised after just a few months. And here, obviously, there's this quote saying that software startups raising Series A 15 months after raising Series C at 2x level of seed valuation. But a year ago, or even further back, there would have been 3 months earlier, and the valuation would have been 3 to 5 times, or whatever.
Yeah.
So that has changed, and that will stick throughout this year. And then he mentioned some silver linings, some more positive things. We'll deep dive into the AI predictions.
And so here, I think quite an interesting set of predictions. We're not going to go through all 24 of them, but definitely worth mentioning at least a couple. And the first one I wanted to bring up is from Brad Van Leeuwen here at Cladara. Brad, who I met a couple of years ago in London. And Cladara is a SaaS marketplace / kind of SaaS management tool. So he has a very good sense of the SaaS industry overall. And he's been talking about how smaller SaaS buyers, as in SMEs buying SaaS products, are outpacing the enterprise buyers in terms of software spend for the first time since 2022. So this means that we're looking at improving market conditions for SaaS companies in general, but also I think that shows how some of the larger enterprises take quite a long time to make their budget cutting decisions. And so we're only now starting to see the sort of net impact of that on SaaS revenue.
And I think that's something that will stick throughout this year. At least those are the signals we get. The other day I spoke to one of the major enterprises here in Sweden who said that CIOs still have the same focus this year, which is to consolidate their stack and their sort of pool of licenses of SaaS software. And they also want to keep the costs down and cut the costs.
So just avoiding tool fragmentation is a theme, I think, at the enterprise level. However, we are still seeing smaller businesses, medium-sized companies, buying these SaaS licenses and trying to optimize their processes. So it's a very interesting dynamic playing out in the SaaS space. Another prediction here I wanted to mention is from our friend Ingrid at Ox. They're looking again, coming to the same point, software tooling consolidation pressure. This is driving this sort of growth from new customer acquisition, right? So you have to look at pricing and packaging and grow revenue within these existing accounts because there is so much pressure to cut SaaS spend.
And an interesting, I think, dynamic there is as well. You have this bundling and unbundling dynamic where typically we've been in SaaS, we've been in this unbundling period where you've seen a lot of SaaS tools doing very specific things, vertical SaaS. At least what I hear now from some CIOs and from some of the incumbents in the SaaS space is that they are now consolidating some of that. So they are taking in some of those services that used to live with growth companies or new startups that have defined a new vertical. They are now being swallowed or actually disintermediated by some of the incumbents. And that actually plays into this, given that the CIOs now, they are actually happy to consolidate. So they're happy to work with only one party.
Oh, they would much prefer to.
They would much prefer to.
And I think that's an absolutely key point here. And it's definitely making it harder for startups that are focused on solving one problem very well, which is obviously how most startups try to go to market. It is the sort of textbook way to do it. Another thing Ingrid says I wanted to talk about is that these sort of generative AI-powered natural language chats are going to become table stakes. They're just expectations. That's not going to be a differentiator. That is just something you have to have in a SaaS product. And so as a result, the pricing power will come from more traditional sources of defensibility, right? Do you have data moats in your product? Is there something proprietary there? Are you a system of record or a single source of truth? And how much automation do you provide? Are you a cost saver for your clients? Those are really the key questions to consider if you're in the SaaS business in 2024, according to Ingrid. And I think definitely holds true based on everything we've been seeing in the market.
Absolutely. I think it will have an effect on the COGS of these SaaS companies, unfortunately, as well. Because we will see at least the generative AI co-pilots, they are quite costly.
Yep. And good news for OpenAI and the other AI vendors or LLM vendors who will, of course, be raking in the token revenue. But it is obviously something that will impact the unit economics of all SaaS companies.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that, I think, in a couple of minutes. But there is also the fact that there is a race among the foundational models, and there will be probably some price cuts.
Why don't we go on to that? I think that's our next topic here.
Let's move on to the AI predictions. I think we've captured this article from VentureBeat, which includes a lot of different predictions from a lot of different funds. We'll not go through all of them. We picked some of the best ones or most interesting ones. These comes from firms like Sapphire Ventures, Generic Catalyst, and among others. I think the first one was opinionated, so I like that one, which is basically that many generative AI companies will die. They allude to this fact that we talk about slapping in a product on top of any LLM in terms of adding just something on top of OpenAI. Wrapper products, which is going to be expensive. I think that's a quite interesting one. And then we have a lot of these predictions that actually saying the same thing, the convergence of data modalities, text, images, audio, which makes a lot of sense. I think it's it's a logical step given, it's almost a low-hanging fruit, I think, for many of the AI technology vendors to go into that. So that, I think, as well, we're going to see. Here is we have the same from Sapphire. AI products today are mostly textual, but users prefer more expressive software that meets them in every modality. And I think audio is an obvious one, obviously video as well. But yeah, here we had this point about race to the bottom in the generative AI pricing between OpenAI, Mistral, Google, etc. I think that's an interesting one. We'll see if they have to cut price. It's depending a bit, I think, on the competition, how fierce it is, and whether the companies or the customers will actually require lower prices to expand their use of these services.
No, and of course, we're also seeing and in fact investing in tools that help for the sort of interoperability between different LLMs, helping companies and developers to figure out what their cost of inference will be between different LLMs. And I think that's where we will see the rubber hit the road for some of these open source models, where suddenly, if you realize as a developer that you can accomplish 99% of the same generation with a free model as you could with one that would cost you, let's say, a few pennies per use, you're going to go with that free model every time. And I think this is the year where we will see that competition heat up between open source, between closed source. It will be the opportunity for these infrastructure tools to really shine in helping developers pick the best model, price the model correctly, and implement it into their tool or application. But let's move on to Fred Wilson. So we've talked a little bit about some European or mostly Nordic VCs and their predictions, but obviously we want to also look at what's going on in the US. And Fred Wilson, who has been running Union Square Ventures, one of America's sort of preeminent VC funds, has his annual prediction, and here is what he's saying for 2024. He says he's been in the tech sector 40 years and he's never seen an environment with more innovation than we have now, and that it's rather breathtaking. He starts with AI. Of course, we've talked about AI a lot already, so we don't need to repeat too much. But where I think he sort of agrees with a lot of what we've been saying here, maybe even somewhat disagrees with one of the predictions you just mentioned, is that we're entering the application era now. And so much like with the browser, we got the application era of the web. With the iPhone, we've got the application era of mobile. Now we're entering this application era for AI. And what that means is that you can actually build, in his view, a decent business or even a great business on top of some of these LLMs from OpenAI, Anthropic, Gemini, Llama, etc. Open source, closed source, that's not really his point here. He's just talking about the value that can be captured by building really interesting, innovative products on top of these models. He then talks, of course, about something that we spent 20 minutes talking about in the last episode, which is regulation and litigation. And of course, we talked about it from an EU perspective. He's talking about it more from an American perspective. Of course,
which is more the litigation rather than regulation.
Right, exactly. That there will be a lot of lawsuits in the AI space, which will lead to a lot of case law being developed, and as a result, some big changes in the way, for instance, copyright is handled, in the way that, for instance, AI has to be marked as AI, and so on and so forth. But then he segues from there over to Web3, which I think is quite interesting because, of course, we in the VC world, at least here in Europe, have been a little bit cooler on crypto and blockchain over the last 12 months or so. And he mentions, of course, quote, a full frontal attack from regulators and lawmakers. But in his view, 2023 was the year that Web3 held its ground despite that onslaught from regulators and from investors. And that in 2024, we will see a sort of new legislative framework around Web3 that might finally give us some clarity in the US and of course, in Europe as well.
Yeah, and I think the US is way ahead here. We've seen a lot of things happening in the US already this year. While there have been this crypto winter, some of the big companies have been moving ahead when it comes to Web3. Both Coinbase have done built a lot of relationships with different banks and financial institutions. And there have been movements in terms of building ETFs and so on crypto. So I think it has been moving while we in Europe have not been as involved.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think one other thing that he mentions, which is super interesting, is that the most important thing for Web3, in his view, is not actually regulatory. It's having a ChatGPT moment. So he talks about AI, which has been developed over 40 years before its coming out party, which was this sort of 2-month journey to 100 million active users on ChatGPT, right? And where is that moment for Web3? We haven't really had it yet. No. He believes that it will happen in less than half the time, half those sort of 40 years it took for AI, and we will start to see mainstream decentralized applications emerge for Web3 in 2024. And I just want to finish this piece from Fred on the AI and Web3 point being two sides of the same coin. And I think that's a really interesting observation, that, you know, AI will make Web3 usable for mainstream applications, and Web3 will help us trust AI. Very interesting way to look at it. And I get what he's saying here, that if you can have this sort of immutable ledger around what was generated and when and by whom, that suddenly the regulatory requirements around labeling things as AI,
copyright,
it's just not as important if you can actually prove things using blockchain. So very interesting way to converge these two technologies, and I think a very interesting prediction.
I think you can also use it for that royalty issue in the AI industry, where we have a lot of copyrighted material that will be used by these. It will also be regulated, particularly in the EU. It has already been part of the EU regulation. So that can definitely be solved to some extent by Web3. It's super interesting.
Absolutely. And of course, there's a lot more from Fred here, including his predictions on sustainability technology, which I'd love to go into, but we don't have time. So we're going to go straight on to Lightspeed.
Yeah, a quick one on this, on Lightspeed. I think there are some interesting insights from them, and I wanted to mention them. First of all, AI shifts towards utility. I think it's a little bit similar to what Fred was saying here, that we will see more applications and they will focus on utility use cases. I think we at Luminar also believe that we will see a lot of companies being built to disrupt large industries, basically using the existing technology, but just build a business concept around an existing industry that will be likely disrupted in the next coming years. AR, again, of course, and we'll see how these pre-sales go. They'll definitely fill up that waiting list very fast.
There are people who will be camping outside Apple stores for weeks
to pay $4,000.
To pay $4,000.
No problem. AI adoption intensifies concerns around consumer data privacy. We have an entire episode about that, so we'll leave it to that, right? But it's good. Watch our last episode.
And subscribe.
AI ushers into new standard of education. I think this is an interesting one. Plagiarism and cheating has already been discussed a lot, especially in the US, where there have been already some cases. Teachers have been implementing different processes and so on to manage this. Crypto summer. Again, I think we can refer to Fred, but it's interesting that they make this similar conclusion. They are mentioning some quite interesting steps that have happened already. Shopify has integrated stablecoin payments. I think one that I like as well is that PayPal launched their own stablecoin very late into the game, but still.
Yeah, but it shows that actually,
player.
I think actually that shows that we're still very early.
Yeah,
in this
it does.
game. Yeah, but it's happening. It's happening now.
430 million users and merchants. It will have an impact eventually.
And to some extent, this is what Fred is saying about the ChatGPT moment for Web3, that now we're seeing these mainstream fintechs, but also marketplaces, Shopify, PayPal, etc., implementing crypto or a stablecoin into their stack.
Absolutely. Yeah. Renewable energy picks up steam. For us, it already picked up steam a long time ago. But for sure, the pricing change happened a few years back, actually, where solar and others came down and became cheaper than the fossil fuels and so on. So I think we will see definitely way more money invested. There are already commitments from the EU and the US to invest a lot in this. We are spending a lot of time and we're spending a lot of our funds as well into this space. It's nothing new to us. And AI and healthcare, again, a similar mention that we had before. So that was some of the ones that I wanted to mention from Lightspeed.
Fantastic. And I think, obviously, as we said, nobody has a crystal ball, right? Nobody really knows what's going to happen. But you can tell from these predictions where the VC hive mind is at this point, right? Which is very excited about AI, still very curious about Web3, and definitely opportunistically looking at different opportunities within it. And of course, always focused on the sustainability stack as well, and the green revolution. Please keep watching. We have more episodes coming about various different topics. We hope you enjoyed it, and please subscribe and ring the bell so you get notified when we release new episodes.